I want to ask you, is your budget loud enough? And how do you know if your budget's loud enough? What's that even mean? Maybe you don't know what loud budgeting is. If you don't know, here's what you need to know. In order to make your budget stick, you're probably going to have to communicate what your boundaries are, what you're willing to do and not willing to do to your friends and family. If you want to know more about that, I've got some stuff for you. So first, let's address this loud budgeting thing. It was started by a guy named Lucas Battles. Apparently, he's a comedian, again, over there on the Ticktok. And let me tell you what I like about what I know about it. I watched a couple of different videos. Some of the biggest finance influencers and finance gurus on YouTube and podcasts had to comment on this thing because apparently it was such a big stir on TikTok. And what we like about it, what I like about it immediately is it's about people telling other people what they're willing to and not willing to spend their money on. They're really communicating what their boundaries are about their financial goals. They're saying, no, I've only budgeted $20 a week. Let's just say, I'm making this up now. I've only budgeted this much money for food and I don't have that much money available to go out to the restaurant tonight. So they're being loud in the sense that they have now communicated. Instead of just saying no and being vague about it, or even worse, saying yes and going along when you know you shouldn't be spending the money, they're being really clear about what their financial goals are, or at least how much money is in the budget available to help them to have that experience, whether it's money in savings, paying down debt, or saving up enough money to buy a house, whatever that may be. Being loud about it just means that you're communicating that with others. And so what's good about it? Well, it encourages this open discussion about finances. And I tell you, as a financial counselor, I was a money coach working for a company which was contracted through employee assistance programs. I spoke with thousands of people. I did somewhere in the ballpark of 12,000 phone calls. Some people I spoke with every couple of weeks, ongoing for many years. Most people I only got to speak with once in one 30-minute phone call. I worked with a team of other financial counselors, tax experts, investment experts, so on and so forth. Lots of different kinds of money coaches at this organization. And one of the major themes is exactly this. People just don't know how to talk about money, or they won't. There's some kind of cultural stigma, it seems, around talking about what their budget is. So they don't ask for help. They don't know how to say no, so on and so forth. We're talking about boundaries here in the money space, in the budget space, in the financial planning space. And so people need help with this. This is one thing I recognized. If you're a person out there that feels like it's hard to talk about money, you're not alone. And that's why I like loud budgeting, because it promotes this kind of transparency. In order to be able to do loud budgeting, well, there's a couple of things that will need to be in place. Let me go through a couple of other ideas about why this communication of boundaries or loud budgeting is a good idea. It strengthens resolve. So for instance, if you're publicly stating what your financial goals are, if you're telling other people about it, the more you do that, the more you see yourself, the more you understand and sense yourself as a person who has the kind of resolve. You're going to feel good about it. It also will enhance accountability. This is a double-edged sword in some ways, but simply put, if your friends and family are supportive, there's an if, I understand that. It's not always the case for us rebels and misfits. If you're a black sheep, for instance, and you're experiencing kind of being on the outside of that support circle, as often happens with my rebels and misfits, then my dogs will start barking in the background and you'll know that you're one of those people. If you have that kind of support, then it actually enhances accountability. So for instance, if I tell my partner in life that I've been spending too much money at the coffee shop and I wanted to funnel more of that money into paying down my student loans, And then I go to the coffee shop and I come home and she says, well, gosh, I thought you wanted to spend more money or put more money toward paying off those student loans faster. See how that's like enhanced some accountability. Or for instance, on the other hand, she might be saying, I want to go to the coffee shop. And I say, well, no, I need to save that $10. I know it's only $10. I'm planning on paying down my student loans by the end of the year, let's say. I'm making this up, right? But, after I've said that, now, when I go to spend $10 on some other thing, I want to go out for a beer with the guys or some other thing, I bet it's going to come up again. So as soon as you start telling people, no, I need to save this money, this $100, this $10, whatever it is, there's a pretty good chance that they'll say something, or even if they don't, you're probably going to fill it. You're going to know that you've already made this statement to somebody. And in many ways, this enhances accountability because you've got other people involved. And because of the way your brain works, because we're all so socially wired, whenever you say anything, whenever you think about saying anything, you can imagine what the responses are going to be from the people that you already know. You can imagine what the responses of the responses of the responses are. I know that's a mind blower. But basically, if someone responds, you can also imagine how someone else will respond to the way that person responds. It's fascinating how complicated our social network is, and the way that our mind, it's called theory of mind, can actually predict how other people will behave in response to our behaviors. And for instance, this is how accountability really works. Someone will respond to the way I've behaved, and someone else will respond to the way that person responded. Mind blown, right? That's what accountability ultimately really is. At the tribal or the nuclear family unit, or within the church, for instance, or within your sports team, or within your platoon in the military, whatever it is, it's because you're going to get some feedback at some level. Someone may judge you, for instance. They may evaluate, or in many cases, let's say, someone may say something to you which either encourages you or discourages you or holds you accountable in some way, because the consequences impact other people. Guess what? We live in that kind of a symbiotic relationship with others, and that's what accountability is really about. Another thing that's really important about this is that it facilitates clear boundaries. And so what are boundaries? I think this warrants a deeper exploration. I want to give you a really simple definition. Basically, the boundaries are this area in which I'm safe and happy. And when someone crosses over into this area, then that threatens my safety, so to speak. That's actually a metaphor. The idea of a boundary is not usually an actual physical boundary. It's usually a sensing about behavior. So for instance, someone starts to raise their voice, you would say that crosses a boundary. You can't shout at me. Or if someone calls me a fool, I personally don't like to be called a fool, and it's partially because of the way I grew up. And in the junior high school specifically, in the junior high school I went to, if someone started calling you a fool, it often meant that they wanted to fight with you. And so now my ears are tuned to this word fool. And I can calmly, and it almost never comes up. It's a silly example, actually. But if someone was to call me a fool today, like they were having fun, I might say, hey, I prefer not. I don't want to hear it. Please don't call me a fool. Now, if I say that to somebody, and then they call me a fool again, either out of habit or maliciously, if they call me a fool, that does not give me permission to cause warfare against them, to fight with them, to raise my voice, or to do something emotionally or physically violent to that person. Unfortunately, I think that's the way people think of boundaries in many cases. Until this is clarified, many people are thinking of boundaries as permission, essentially, because this rule was broken. They now have permission to punish the other person in some way or another, through a guilt trip, through some kind of an obligation of behavior on that other person's part. Something like that. That person essentially could be punished, often through some kind of verbal or emotional abuse, and in some cases even some kind of a physical space abuse or money abuse or something like that. All these variations could apply. But that's not what boundaries are about. Basically, what it is you're saying, you're making a request to that other person, but it's not just a request. It's not an open-ended request for take it or leave it, it's fine. I don't care, I'm just making a request. It's the kind of request that has a consequence where I have behavior associated with the consequence. So for instance, if a person calls me a fool, then I know that I actually need to distance myself from that person. And that might mean that I actually just kind of stop talking with them. I may repeat again, I may hold the boundary by repeating it again. Sometimes people need to hear these things several times, they just don't get it. What I want to make sure is really clear, though, is that this is not giving you permission to be a persecutor or to provide some kind of punishment to another person. Really, it's a consequence for myself about, or it's a consequence for you. If you've stated a boundary and someone has violated that boundary, you have to decide what the appropriate consequences which you will carry out. And that might mean you're going to tell them that you're not going to spend time with them anymore. You need to break off the relationship, for instance. And that's not necessarily punishment. Your attitude, your tone, the energy around how you would actually break off that relationship, it could wildly vary. If you think that you now have permission or are required to punish this person, then your attitude and tone would be wildly different than as if you're recognizing that it's a basic consequence that you're carrying out, and that it's a big difference when you have an intention of carrying out emotional violence or certainly physical violence or anything like that. Punishment is very different from I'm going to do what I need to do to keep myself safe and happy. Okay, so as it goes, I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole here. I wanted to describe what boundaries are in the context of this. And so you want to start to really understand whether or not your budget is loud enough. Here's some concerns around this. And this is what maybe should be coming up and probably is a big part of the reason that people don't talk about money more. Here's kind of a downside to so-called loud budgeting and one of the pitfalls of communicating boundaries in general. In fact, I would tell you that I didn't like boundaries because of this. There is always power dynamics at play when we're talking about boundaries. And I think that's often overlooked. Boundaries actually don't work very well if you're a person in the low power position. You might have a difficult time communicating your boundaries and upholding your boundaries and carrying out consequences because your choices may be limited if you're in the low power position. So for instance, if I were to try and communicate my boundaries to my boss, I might say, hey, listen, I don't want you to use that tone with me. I mean, could you imagine saying that to your boss, first of all? My last several employers were fantastic. So this is certainly not about, my employers. It is something I've experienced though. Many years ago, 20 years ago, I did have some employers, some managers that were rude, and they would say things, sometimes use words that I found to be very distasteful, even name calling. And clearly the tone in which they spoke with me was just unprofessional and flat out disrespectful. And so I certainly could have, and actually I did, let them know that I felt like they're being disrespectful. And in some cases, they will self-recognize that they are being disrespectful and change their attitude and tone. In other cases, they will now use their own power against you. Maybe they'll tell you, if you don't like it, go find another job. I've heard that from people. You don't have to work here, Jeremy. I heard that. You could go find another job if you don't like it, right? And so this can also happen in personal relationships. Sometimes there are power struggles. This is not uncommon. People have power struggles in their personal relationships with their partners, spouses, and so forth. I have a teenage daughter, and as she matures, and probably because of hormones and sometimes, there are some things that seem like power struggles. Of course, on my end, it's my job to basically just stay cool and come back to the conversation perhaps at another time as it goes. And usually it's pretty mild. These are common examples. This is why I'm discussing this. Another thing that could happen, and this is why I was uncomfortable with boundaries, because I first started hearing this term when I was a teenager, and my father was an alcoholic. And so communicating my boundaries, holding my boundaries, and upholding consequences from my end about how I will behave or interact or what I will allow from my father, who was much bigger than me and could be sometimes physically violent, was often, especially when he had been heavily drinking or the next day, was emotionally abusive. all of those things could play out and cause me more problems if I was communicating my boundaries in a way that was not artful and careful. And it was difficult for me to change my circumstances enough to carry out the consequences, which may have been necessary at that time. I mean, nothing short of, for instance, calling CPS, or other things. What I learned to do sometimes is call grandma. This is a work in progress, but the point is that these boundaries can be difficult if there is power dynamics that are not helpful to the person who is trying to communicate and uphold boundaries. And this needs to be acknowledged, right? So sometimes it's not as simple as just saying, look, here's my request, and then being clear about what consequences. You might have a limited options on what those consequences are. And the reason this all needs to be stated right now is because those consequences, or what your options may be, what you think your options are in your situation, may be partially imaginary. I'm assuming that you're adult-ish. If you're old enough to be concerned about budgeting or boundaries at all, you're probably not a child living with your parents. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. The point is that you may have a great deal more power and autonomy in your situation than you recognize. Getting divorced is not easy, but sometimes, if you're in an abusive relationship, for instance, it's the thing that needs to happen. And I have helped many people go through the steps necessary to organize their finances in divorce. I'm not an attorney, certainly not a divorce attorney. I can't help you with any of the legal aspect, but I can talk to, and I have helped many people to understand how to organize their personal budget so that they can move out, for instance, understand what to expect from what the typical laws are. Again, I'm not an attorney. It's not legal advice, but I understand how divorce proceedings work and have helped people with that kind of thing. And there's a great deal of communicating boundaries that goes on in that divorce process. Why am I talking about divorce now? Well, again, we're talking about you might have to change your situation dramatically. You might have to carry out consequences if a person is violating boundaries. And that's an extreme example. Let's go to more regular examples. So for instance, here's a common thing. This happens in my household. I mean, it happened today, literally. My daughter wanted to go to some restaurant. I picked her up from school and she's like, I'm hungry. And I'm like, all right, well, what would you like to do about it? Actually, what I said is, congratulations, you're alive. You have this sense of hunger. Wow, isn't that fantastic? Which she did not find to be amusing. Dad jokes all the time, right? But then she starts to ask, she makes a request. It's not a boundary. This is a request. Can we go to Chick-fil-A? Can we go to, what about, what's it called? Sourdough and Co. And she mentioned like 3 places. And I was like, well, no. First of all, I don't want to spend that much money on food that really wouldn't be healthy. Sourdough and Co. might be better, but if I'm going to spend, $20 or maybe $25 on a couple of sandwiches and some drinks, I'd prefer to just go home and make sandwiches. I know they wouldn't be as fancy, but I would prefer to just go home. And she said, okay, right? And so this is actually me, actually being clear about what my values are, which is what boundaries ultimately are about. You're saying, no, I don't want to, because here's what my values are. It's even better if you can actually talk about what your emotions are that are related to this. What your feeling and or sensations in your bodies might be will also work well. It's something that's true for you from your own perspective. It really cannot be argued. And if someone tries to argue about this, that's probably a boundary violation. I am feeling XYZ. In my case, I just said I don't want to, which is an expression of a feeling in some respects, sort of. Really an expression of value. We're splitting hairs there. I am feeling because I want, and then, of course, make another request or state what your suggested strategy would be. And so, again, what I said was, I'm feeling because I think it's too much money. I don't need a fancy sandwich. I'd prefer to just go home. Of course, which she accepted it. All of this more or less fits within the description of what loud budgeting is, and also what the budget and boundaries may look like in a regular conversation. So I want to make this really clear. We're going to go through this again really, really quickly here. First of all, just identify. Don't judge. Don't diagnose. Just identify in simple terms what it is, when it occurs. perhaps who it occurs with, as a clear observation, not as a judgment. Not you are a such and such, or it is a such and such, or this always happens, or any kind of other diagnosis about what will happen or prediction about what will happen. Just it is in basic terms that doesn't have any color on it. So that often is the way to start with these kinds of things. And then go to start to talk about what your feelings are in response to what you're noticing there. Again, this is a first person thing. You're just being open and honest about what your feelings are. Again, this is user beware. You can't do this totally everywhere you're at all the time. You can say, I'm feeling uncomfortable, or I have a sense of XYZ. I feel, I want. You're getting into that territory where you can say something that seems to fit. Then you want to talk about what your higher priorities are. Really appeal to the highest priority possible within the context of the situation. You may think of these as psychological or emotional needs. And in some conversations, like with my spouse, for instance, or even with my daughter, I will label the psychological or emotional need. I have a need for autonomy, I may say, for instance. I have a need for safety and security, and that means keeping more money in savings. I prefer not to spend that money. I have a need for adventure. And so in that respect, I'd like to just wing it. I don't want to spend the extra money on this other thing. The need, this subjective part of my experience, may actually be a strongly held value. It doesn't actually have to be a need. We could really split hairs on what this word need even means. So the point is that it's a high priority. This is what I see. This is what I hear. This is what I feel. Here's the emotion related to that, possibly. I am sad because, I'm happy because, I'm excited because. Related to this high priority, I need autonomy. So I'm hoping to give you some framework here about how to state these boundaries. And then you follow through with a request or a suggested strategy. I want, would you please, would you consider, I'd like you to consider. Or how about we do XYZ? What do you think about XYZ? With my daughter, the way I was saying it, my tone of voice was actually saying, I don't need a fancy sandwich. I prefer to just go home. The way that's phrased is actually as if it's a question. It is a statement, but it's phrased as if it's a question, right? So I prefer to just go home, which is like, you can even hear in the pitch of my voice, it kind of curves up at the end. It's a question in some respect. I'm asking her if that's okay with her. I'm asking her to accept that suggestion, essentially. So that's the framework around this. And I'll put this all out on the screen here. Hopefully maybe it's here. Is it floating here now? Do I have letters? Do I have text here? I don't know. What I want you to know is that you don't have to share anything that needs to be held private. There's certainly privacy concerns that are related to loud budgeting, potentially. It doesn't have to be that way, but you don't need to tell people how much money's in your bank account. You certainly don't need to let them know about what you're going to spend your money on. There may be privacy concerns, so consider that in terms of boundaries. Don't overshare. Don't say something that would make you financially vulnerable. It's okay to be a little emotionally vulnerable sometimes, but don't actually violate your own safety, especially when it comes to the financial end of that. Telling people you don't have money could be potentially putting yourself at risk, or giving yourself, or overexposing some kind of personal information. So certainly be considerate. Don't be too loud. It only needs to be loud enough, right? And so what we're really trying to do here is amplify real exchange of empathy. So that's why we've identified, without judgment, what our emotions are, our feelings and sensations, and how those feelings and sensations are related to our highest held values, to priorities. For instance, in my first example, paying down my student loans by the end of the year, I could have actually filled that out by saying, I'll really be excited, there's an emotion, to pay down my student loans by the end of the year and just be free from that debt. When I say free from that debt, I'm expressing a real value, this sense of freedom of being, freed from that debt. So what we want to do with this loud budgeting, when you ask yourself, is it loud enough, is to really fulfill the opportunity to create an empathetic exchange. You're putting enough, just enough information on the table here so that people can empathize, but not so much so that they take advantage of you. Again, power dynamics can be an issue. So you'll have to know how much is enough and keep yourself safe. This could put you in positions, for instance, where there's potential judgment from others. Could put you in positions where there's pressure, peer pressure for people who don't really respect your boundaries. The power dynamics are always an issue. And that's why people don't talk about their money. This can be done artfully. You have to know your audience. That's really important here. I want you to make sure that in order to do this well, you've got to really be clear about what your goals are. Let's segue this to another video where basically the budget is about point A to point B. Go watch that video too. All right, like, subscribe and stuff. Okay, goodbye.